Welcome back, fellow deep divers. If you've ever found yourself pondering the very nature of reality, the limits of knowledge, or just how we fit into this grand cosmic scheme of things, well, today's deep dive is right up your alley. We're about to plunge headfirst into the intricate and incredibly profound thought of Ibn Arabi. Now, even if that name doesn't immediately ring a bell, trust me, this is a thinker whose ideas have had a ripple effect across centuries, and his insights still resonate powerfully today, especially for those of us, with a philosophical bent.
Oh, absolutely. He's a giant in the history of thought, no question. And for anyone fascinated by, the architecture of reality itself, how being manifests and how on earth we can even begin to grasp it, Ibn Arabi offers a system that's both incredibly intricate and remarkably comprehensive.
You hit the nail on the head there. Now, you might have stumbled across Ibn Arabi labeled as a Sufi mystic. And while, sure, his work definitely delves into those mystical dimensions, that label alone really doesn't do justice to the sheer breadth of his intellectual contributions. We're talking Quran commentary, hadith, jurisprudence, theology, philosophy, you name it. He explored it deeply.
What's really fascinating from a philosophical perspective is how Ibn Arabi brings all these fields together. Unlike many thinkers who sort of compartmentalize their areas of expertise, he weaves them together thematically in these grand tapestries of thought.
Exactly. And the level of rigor and intellectual energy he sustains across, literally thousands of pages is astounding. It's no wonder that the later Sufi tradition honored him with the title Al-Shaykh Al-Akbar, the greatest master. That wasn't just an honorary title. It reflected a profound conviction that his grasp of Islamic tradition reached a level of depth and nuance that, well, was pretty much unparalleled. But for centuries, his brilliance remained mostly hidden from Western eyes. How did a figure with such profound influence within the Islamic world stay under the radar in the West for so long?
It's a curious thing, isn't it? And there are probably a few reasons for that. For one thing, direct lines of influence aren't always easy to trace. Plus, his writings are undeniably complex. The sheer density and intricacy of his thought can be, well, intimidating, to say the least.
For sure. I mean, some early Western scholars kind of took one look and I think threw up their hands. They slapped labels like mystic or pantheist on him without really grappling with the depth of his philosophical system. But things started to change in the mid-20th century, and a lot of that is due to the groundbreaking work of scholars like Henry Corbin and Toshihiko Izutsu. What they did was bring this laser-focused philosophical attention to one of Ibn Arabi's more concise works, Fusus al-Hikam, the Ringstones of the Wisdoms. Why was this text so pivotal in opening up Ibn Arabi's work to the West?
Ringstones is like this incredibly dense, almost poetic distillation of some of his core ideas. And while it's much shorter than his magnum opus, it provided this crucial entry point for Western scholars who were ready to engage with his ideas on a deeper level.
And when we say magnum opus, we're talking about Al-Futuhat al-Makkiyah, the Meccan openings, a work that clocks in at a staggering 15,000 pages in its modern edition. That's not just a book, it's like an entire intellectual universe.
And scholars are still working on, translating, interpreting, and placing this absolutely massive work within the broader context of intellectual history. It's like this vast interconnected web of ideas that we're still trying to untangle and appreciate.
And it gets even more fascinating when you start to consider the parallel scholars have drawn between Ibn Arabi and thinkers in the West like Meister Eckhart and Nicholas of Cusa. These connections suggest this, shared intellectual quest for truth that transcends geographical and historical boundaries. And, the parallels don't stop there. Some even suggest Ibn Arabi's insights anticipate certain concepts we find in modern physics and contemporary philosophical discourse.
Absolutely. And for those of us, interested in epistemology and the challenges of defining the knowable, Ibn Arabi's concept of barzakh is particularly intriguing. Some have suggested that it might even offer a framework for tackling the problem of defining the indefinable, this age-old philosophical conundrum.
Now that's a real mind bender, a potential bridge between these seemingly disparate philosophical worlds. And this cross-cultural relevance extends eastward as well, with comparisons to figures like Shankara, Zhuangzi, and Dogen. Even within the Islamic world, his ideas flourished in unique ways, especially in places like China, where they blended with existing frameworks like Confucianism. So where do we even begin with a thinker as multifaceted as Ibn Arabi?
Well, a great starting point is his methodology, which his later follower, Kunawi, termed Mashrab al-Taqiq, the school of realization. And for anyone concerned with how we come to know anything at all, Taqiq is really the bedrock of Ibn Arabi's entire project.
Okay, so let's unpack Taqiq a bit. It comes from the same root as the words haq and hakika, which have all sorts of philosophical weight in Islamic thought, right?
Absolutely. Haq can mean true, real, right, just even appropriate. These days, we even talk about human rights using that same root. And hakika refers to reality, truth, the very essence of things.
So how did Ibn Arabi connect these ideas to Taqiq?
Well, he saw tahqiq, or realization, as something that went way beyond mere logic or just abstract knowledge. It was profoundly ontological, existential even. It wasn't enough to just intellectually grasp truth. You had to live it, embody it. You had to align yourself with the real in every aspect of your being and your actions.
It's almost like an active existential verification process. Understanding isn't passive. It's deeply intertwined with how you live in the world. And there's a saying of the prophet that gets at this. Everything has a hack, so give to each that has a hack its hack.
How did Ibn Arabi interpret that in light of tahqiq?
For him, that was a fundamental principle governing all of existence. Everything, whether it's an aspect of the universe, a social interaction, or an inner state of your soul, has this inherent rightness, a proper way of being and being treated, and the human task is to discern and enact that rightness in relation to all things. So it's like recognizing the fundamental claim to being of everything around you. There's an ethical dimension woven into the very fabric of being, and this idea of giving everything its hack that must connect back to the core of Islam, the declaration of God's oneness. There is no God but God.
Exactly. There's another hadith that elaborates on that, saying that this primary hack, this fundamental truth of divine unity, is the foundation upon which all other hacks rest.
So ultimate reality resides in the real, in God, and true rightness comes from aligning yourself with that.
Precisely. And that understanding, known as tawhid, the affirmation of divine oneness, is really the bedrock of Islamic faith. And for Ibn Arabi, tahqiq is all about realizing, both intellectually and existentially, this tawhid.
And even philosophical systems that don't explicitly invoke a divine being often operate on a similar principle of a single ultimate ground of being, a first cause.
That's a really good point. And Ibn Arabi was very clear that Taqi wasn't just about intellectually assenting to this unity. He drew a sharp distinction between tahqiq and taqid.
Taqlid being what? Imitation or blindly following authority.
Right. He really emphasized that genuine knowledge comes not just from transmission of information, what's called naqli, but through this active process of realization, taqi.
Yeah.
He even distinguishes between transmitted knowledge, things like language or historical facts, things we learn by imitation, and intellectual knowledge, which we attain by realizing its truth within ourselves, like mathematical principles or metaphysical truths.
So it's like taking knowledge and making it your own, transforming it from something external to something you grasp internally.
Exactly. And while a lot of Islamic philosophers agreed that authentic knowledge requires this kind of inner realization, Ibn Arabi goes a step further. He posits that the complete realization of one's potential, the full actualization of the soul's possibilities, all its spiritual, cosmic, and divine dimensions, that can only be fully achieved by following the guidance of the prophets.
So it's not just about reason and intellect. It's about this prophetically guided path to truly comprehending reality. Now, shifting gears a bit, let's talk about another foundational aspect of his thought, divine speech, and the concept of the three books.
Oh, this is where the profound influence of the Quran on Ibn Arabi's thought really comes into sharp focus. As someone interested in truth and how it's revealed, you'll find it fascinating how deeply he immersed himself in the divine word. His writings are absolutely saturated with Quranic verses and terminology. It's like the very fabric of his discourse.
He sees the Quran as divine speech, kalam, which is both completely inseparable from the essence of God, and yet manifest in the act of recitation and in its written form. But this divine speech isn't confined to just the text itself, is it?
No, not at all. Ibn Arabi believed that God's speech is also revealed in the universe itself and within the human soul. And that leads to this idea of profound correspondences, these deep homologies between the cosmos, the soul, and scripture. Everything, in a sense, is made up of signs, ayat, pointing to a deeper reality.
The source material even describes the cosmos as the Great Quran, composed of letters, words, chapters, and verses. That's such a powerful way to think about the universe as inherently meaningful.
Absolutely. And Ibn al-Arabi gives this beautiful analogy to illustrate this. He compares God's act of creation to human speech. Just as we use our breath to articulate words, God brings the universe into being by uttering words within the breath of the All-Merciful, Nafas al-Rahman. He even equates existence itself with divine mercy, Rahma, suggesting that being is an expression of divine benevolence.
So reality itself is a form of communication, a continuous unfolding of meaning. And he even has this cosmological scheme where he links the levels of cosmic manifestation to the 28 letters of the Arabic alphabet.
Yeah, it's this really detailed and nuanced system where each letter represents a particular modality or articulation of existence. But going back to the three books, the written Quran holds this special place in understanding these broader revelations. Why would that be?
Because it articulates the divine names and those cosmic and sulic signs in human language. It becomes like the key to deciphering the other two books.
Exactly. By studying and interpreting the Quran, we gain the tools we need to interpret the signs in the cosmos and in our own souls. And Ibn Arabi consistently grounds his philosophical discussions in specific Quranic verses, often uncovering layers of meaning that might not be obvious at first glance. While he insists on staying true to the original Arabic, he also comes up with these strikingly original insights, reflecting his belief in the, inexhaustible depth of the Quran's wisdom.
And that ability to remain grounded in the text while unearthing these new layers of meaning is a big part of what earned him the title of the greatest master. The source material also mentions this principle. No repetition in God's self-disclosure, la takar fi al-tajalli. What are the implications of that idea?
That principle is deeply rooted in the fundamental unity of the real. It suggests that every single thing and every moment in time is unique, inherently irreplaceable. Because God's creative words, like our own spoken words, are always being renewed, there's this constant recreation of the cosmos, this perpetual flux within all things.
So reality, from this perspective, isn't static, but this dynamic, ever-unfolding expression of the divine. Okay, let's turn to a core philosophical concern.
Ontology, and specifically the idea most often associated with Ibn Arabi, the oneness of being, or Wadat al-Wujud. This is where things get really interesting, but also potentially confusing.
It is important to remember that even though Ibn Arabi is closely associated with the doctrine of Wadat al-Wujud, he never actually used that exact phrase himself. While some passages in his writings might hint at it, he didn't make it a central point of emphasis, and his views were largely in line with the general philosophical and theological consensus of his time.
So why this strong association with Wadat al-Wujud if he didn't explicitly use the term? Well, a few things probably contributed to that. He places a huge emphasis on tawhid, divine unity, and the term wujud, which means existence or being, is absolutely central to his thought. For him, it was just self-evident that there is no real being, wujud, apart from God, and everything else has this sort of derived or contingent being, echoing Avicenna's idea of necessary, impossible being. His later followers, especially Qunawi, really developed this line of thinking, emphasizing real being as the sole ultimate reality.
And the controversy surrounding Wadat al-Wujud seems to have started later, with Ibn Taymiyyah's criticisms, right?
Exactly. Ibn Taymiyyah, a few centuries after Ibn Arabi, was the first to really pin the doctrine of Wadat al-Wujud on him, seeing it as this dangerous idea that blurred the lines between creator and creation. That sparked this huge debate, with people interpreting Wadat al-Wujud in all sorts of ways. The source mentions at least 7 different understandings. Even Western Orientalists got in on the debate, sometimes agreeing with Ibn Taymiyyah, sometimes offering more sympathetic readings.
So it's a term with this long history of contested interpretations. So, if not Wadat al-Wujud specifically, how did Ibn Arabi articulate the nature of real being?
He often talked about non-delimitation, mutlaq. So, to call real being one is to emphasize the absolute unity of the divine essence, which he often equates with light.
So being, or light, is fundamentally without limits.
Right. Infinite, absolute, undefined, indistinct, indistinguishable in its pure essence. And in contrast to that, all the things that exist, the majudat, are inherently delimited, defined, limited in their specific manifestations.
So you have this radical transcendence of the real, this complete lack of limitation, but at the same time, an immanence, a self-disclosure that pervades all things.
Exactly. The real is both utterly incomparable in its essence and yet manifests and discloses itself in every aspect of creation. Ibn Arabi even takes it a step further, saying that its non-delimitation is so complete that it isn't even limited by non-delimitation itself. He uses the phrase non-delimited delimitation.
So God possesses all the possible delimitations, even though he is non-delimited being.
Right. Think of pure light. It's colorless and formless in itself, but it can manifest in an endless variety of colors and shapes when it's refracted through a prism.
That's a lot to wrap your head around. Okay, let's move on to a concept that the source highlights as super important in Ibn Arabi's thought imagination, khayal.
Oh, yes. Imagination is absolutely key for understanding Ibn Arabi. And he was actually pretty critical of a lot of philosophers and theologians for neglecting its cognitive significance. He saw reason, equal, which he sometimes metaphorically linked to this idea of a fetter or limitation, as primarily operating through delimitation, definition, analysis, focusing on distinctions and the transcendence of the divine.
So reason is good at dividing and analyzing. What about imagination? What did he think it was capable of?
For Ibn Arabi, imagination, when it's disciplined and cultivated, has this unique ability to perceive God's self-disclosure in ways that a purely literal or rational interpretation can't. He saw the symbolic and metaphorical language of Scripture, as well as the constantly changing nature of the cosmos and the human soul, as needing this imaginative faculty to be understood on a deeper level.
So it's not just about cold, hard logic. It's about engaging with the symbolic and metaphorical dimensions of reality.
Exactly. This aligns with Henry Corbin's idea of creative imagination, although Ibn Arabi's vocabulary might not have a perfect equivalent for that term.
And the heart, Kolb, plays a central role here, right? It's where reason and imagination come together.
Yes. Ibn Arabi describes the heart as having two eyes, one for reason and one for imagination. And he believed that if one faculty dominated the other, it would distort your perception of reality. The heart, as the seat of consciousness, needs to be able to see both God's utter incomparability, which is where reason comes in, and his intimate nearness, which is where imagination comes in.
So imagination helps us grasp the underlying oneness of being, while reason provides the necessary distinctions for understanding the diversity of things. The real is both the one and the many, al-wahid al-katir, and we need both faculties to truly grasp it. But when Ibn Arabi talks about imagination, he's not just talking about a psychological faculty, is he?
No, he gives imagination a profound ontological status as well. He uses the term khayal in a way that resonates more closely with its everyday meaning image.
Like reflections, dreams, shadows, things that are and aren't real in the same way as physical objects.
Exactly. Images always mediate between two realities, having characteristics of both but not being reducible to either. A reflection in a mirror depends on both the object and the reflecting surface, but it still has its own existence, however dependent. And Ibn Arabi applies this to the very nature of reality itself through the concept of the three worlds of imagination.
Okay, let's break down these three worlds. First, we have non-delimited imagination, al-khayal al-mutlaq. What's that all about?
In its broadest sense, it encompasses everything that isn't absolutely real. So the entire cosmos, as this contingent, ever-changing manifestation of divine names and attributes, is seen as an expression of this non-delimited imagination. Every created thing is both a face of God, revealing certain aspects, and a veil, concealing others.
So it's this fundamental both-hand quality at the heart of existence. Then we have the mundus imaginalis, alam al-khayal, the in-between realm. Henry Corbin really emphasized this in his work.
Yes, the mundus imaginalis is this really crucial concept for understanding Ibn Arabi's cosmology and epistemology. Islam often talks about the unseen and the visible realms, but Ibn Arabi brings out the significance of this intermediate realm. It's more real than the physical world, but less real than the purely spiritual realm.
So it's like this bridge between the spiritual and the corporeal, and it's also where things like angelic and demonic appearances, resurrection, visions, dreams, they all kind of make sense.
Exactly. Ibn Arabi's emphasis on the mundus imaginalis prevented Islamic philosophy from collapsing into this rigid dualism of mind and body or a purely abstract intellectualism.
And finally, the third world of imagination. Where does that fit in?
That's the microcosmic human imagination, which Ibn Arabi identifies with the soul itself, nafs. The soul is where spirit, ruh, meets body, psychicism. And all our experiences, perceptions, thoughts, emotions, they're all inherently imaginal, a blend of the spiritual and the physical. It's what gives us the capacity for transformation, the freedom to choose to move towards light or towards darkness.
So imagination isn't just a faculty of the mind. It's a fundamental dimension of reality that operates on these different levels. And that brings us to the concept of barzakh.
Barzakh is a really interesting term. It means isthmus, barrier, or limit. It shows up in the Quran in different contexts, like the separation of fresh and salt water or the state of the soul after death.
So theologians typically understood it as the intermediate abode of the soul after death. But Ibn Arabi broadens the idea quite a bit.
Oh, absolutely. For him, Barzakh means anything that separates and brings together two different realities without being reducible to either one. Like the line between light and shadow, it separates them, but it's neither pure light nor pure shadow. He even talks about the supreme Barzakh, al-Barzakh al-Allah.
Which is another way of talking about non-delimited imagination.
Right, the cosmos, the realm of infinite possibilities, the breath of the all-merciful.
So the entire created realm is this Barzakh, existing between the pure light of the real and the darkness of non-being.
Exactly. And it has characteristics of both, acting as this mediating middle ground. Ibn Uri even connects this to the Quranic verse where it says that humans have been shown two paths, symbolizing our existence in this in-between state and our freedom to choose between light and darkness.
It's this idea of human agency within this ontological framework. So let's get into how Ibn Arabi understands the relationship between God and the multitude of things in the world, Ashia and Haqqi.
Well, he explains that the divine names, which represent universal qualities, are present in everything because of their connection to the divine essence.
So things like life, knowledge, power, mercy, these are all attributes of God that permeate all of existence.
Right. But the degree to which they manifest in a particular thing depends on that thing's preparedness, istidad, or its capacity for reception, qabiliyah. So everything can be seen as a face of God, but it also acts as a veil, concealing other aspects. It's like the sun shining on everything, but each object absorbs and reflects the light differently depending on what it's made of.
That's a great analogy. So what determines this preparedness?
Ibn Arabi says it's determined by a thing's reality, hakia, or its quiddity, mahia, its essence, its whatness. And this isn't something we humans define. It's determined by God's eternal knowledge of that thing.
And he calls these realities things, ashia, or entities, ayan, but they don't have true independent existence, do they?
No, only real being, wujud, which is synonymous with God, truly exists. These things are more like possibilities, mumkin, that may or may not be brought into existence.
So they're like potentialities, latent possibilities within the realm of infinite possibility.
Exactly. And when a thing comes into existence, it's like a specific self-disclosure of real being, a face of God, a word spoken within the all-merciful breath. They reveal being and its attributes, but they also act as veils because of their inherent limitation. Each entity is a barzakh, both reflecting reality and pointing to its own contingency.
And God's knowledge encompasses all these things eternally, both in their general aspects and in their specific details.
Precisely. And when the right time comes for a thing to manifest, and remember, we're talking about time in a non-temporal sense here, it's more like the unfolding of divine will. God issues the engendering command, al-amr al-takwini.
Which is the word be, kun.
Right. And that brings the thing into existence, Khan. Ibn Arabi even uses this concept of the thingness of fixity, shay al-utbut, to describe how these things exist within God's knowledge before they manifest. The engendering command doesn't change their inherent thingness. It's being itself that's being manifested, but in this delimited, specific way. Think of light shining through stained glass. The light is the same, but it appears in different colors depending on the glass.
Okay, that makes sense. Now, what about this idea of fixed entities, ayin thabata?
Fixed entities are basically the same as the things we've been talking about, but viewed from the perspective of their status within God's knowledge before creation.
Some translations use terms like archetypes or essences, but that can be misleading, right?
Yes, because it sounds like they exist in some separate realm of forms. But the point is, there's no difference in their fundamental whatness between these fixed entities and the existent entities, ayan majuda. They're not different blueprints. They're the same realities considered in two different states, known by God and manifested in the cosmos.
So the fixed entity is the thing, as God knows it eternally. And the existent entity is that same thing when it's brought into manifestation.
Exactly. And this idea of fixed entities actually helps resolve the whole debate about the eternity versus the createdness of the world. By grounding the realities of things in God's eternal knowledge, Ibn Arabi reconciles these seemingly opposing viewpoints.
That's really insightful. Now, the source also mentions that everything can be considered a divine name, a specific face of God, washkas. Why is that?
Because each thing represents a specific delimitation or specification of non-delimited being. Ibn Arabi acknowledges the traditional 99 names of God, but he also says that there are actually infinitely many divine names.
Because there are infinitely many possible things, and each one reflects a specific facet of God.
Right. Now let's talk about the reality of realities, hakikat al-haqiq, and this process of entification, ta'yun.
Sounds pretty complex.
It can be, but it's worth exploring. So Ibn al-Arabi is careful about using the word shay, which means thing, when referring to God, because it's such a general term. But he does sometimes talk about the one entity, al-ayn al-wahida, which kind of foreshadows the later idea of the oneness of being.
And there's also this idea of the third thing.
The third thing is a really interesting concept. Ibn Arabi describes it as something that's neither absolutely existent nor absolutely non-existent, neither eternal nor created.
It's like it transcends all those categories.
Right. And when you look at the context, it becomes clear that he's basically talking about non-delimited imagination, the supreme barzakh, that in-between realm we discussed earlier. He says that the cosmos comes from this third thing, which he also calls the reality of realities, the intelligible realm, and even identifies with both the cosmos and the real.
So it's a way to talk about this intermediary nature of reality itself. And the third thing is connected to the reality of realities.
Yes, although third thing didn't become a standard term in his school. But the reality of realities, which is also called the universal reality and the Mohammedan reality, did become a central concept. And it represents both the totality of divine knowledge, encompassing all things, and the totality of creation as it unfolds in the cosmos.
So it's where divine self-disclosure happens.
Exactly. And his followers use terms like most holy effusion, al-fayd al-aqdas, to refer to the reality of realities as it exists in God, and holy effusion, al-fayd al-muqaddas, for the creative act itself.
And Kunawi, a key figure in Ibn Arabi's school, used the term tayyun, entification, to describe this process.
Right. Tayyun means the process by which non-delimited being becomes limited, determined, thingish. So all created things are like specific entifications or delimitations of the non-entification, Allah tayyun, which refers to absolute non-delimited being. And the reality of realities is considered the first entification, the first way that the absolute becomes determined.
Okay, so it's like the first ripple in the stillness of pure being. And lastly, let's talk about Ibn Arabi's understanding of human potential and the perfect man, al-insan al-kamil.
Well, Ibn Arabi, like many philosophers, sees the human soul as having this huge, often unrealized potential. And he sees the goal of life as actualizing that potential. But as you mentioned, his understanding goes beyond the purely intellectual to include the imaginal faculty, which we talked about earlier.
And he talks about the ascent of the soul, the miraj, comparing it to the Prophet Muhammad's night journey. How does he see the journey of a philosopher compared to the journey of someone following the prophetic tradition?
He suggests that while both may ascend through similar realms and gain certain understandings, the philosopher's journey is limited by its reliance on reason and knowledge from the natural world. But the follower of the prophetic path, guided by revelation and the example of the prophet, benefits from the wisdom and guidance of the prophets at each stage of the ascent within the mundus imaginalis.
So they achieve a more complete and transformative realization of reality.
Right. And this realization culminates in what's called the station of no station, maqam la maqam, or the Mohammedan station.
And what's the significance of that?
Each spiritual station, maqam, represents the actualization of a particular divine attribute. But the station of no station represents the ultimate realization, the full apprehension of the reality of realities.
It's like encompassing all stations without being limited by any one of them.
Exactly. It's analogous to non-delimited being itself, which assumes all determinations without being limited by any of them. And the person who reaches this realization is what Ibn Arabi calls the perfect man.
The al-insan al-kamil. So the perfect man has gone through the whole cycle of existence, descended into limitation and ascended back to the source, reaching the station of no station.
Right. And such a being embodies all these seemingly contradictory attributes. Henat, he, eternal newly arrived, infinite effinite, reflecting the very nature of ultimate reality.
And the perfect man isn't just an individual achievement. He plays a specific role in the cosmos.
Exactly. He's God's vice-regent, Khalifa, the intermediary between the divine and creation, The source even compares him to the spirit that animates the cosmos, with the cosmos as his body.
And then there's this framework of the five divine presences, Maladat Ilayat Alkams.
That's a framework developed by his followers, particularly Qunawi, to explain how the reality of realities manifests through the perfect man. A presence, Hadra, is a realm where being manifests under a particular quality, and the five presences are the reality of realities in its unmanifested essence, the unseen world, the Alam al-Khail, the visible world, and the perfect man who encompasses all four.
So the perfect man is like the ultimate manifestation of the divine in creation.
Exactly.
Well, this has been a truly mind-blowing deep dive into the thought of Ibn Arabi. It's clear why his ideas continue to fascinate and challenge philosophers today. His system is so intricate and comprehensive, weaving together metaphysics, ontology, epistemology, our understanding of human nature, and it's all unlike anything else in the history of philosophy.
Absolutely. And the way he integrates reason, intuition, and revelation is just so powerful. He's a thinker who continues to spark exploration and debate across all sorts of intellectual disciplines.
And for all you philosophers out there, as you continue your own intellectual journeys, consider this. Given Ibn Arabi's emphasis on the imaginal realm, how might our understanding of consciousness, perception, and experience be transformed if we took that dimension more seriously? It's something to ponder as we wrap up this deep dive, and we encourage you to explore Ibn Arabi's work and the scholarship surrounding it. You won't regret it.